Welcome to Arcade Recaps. Tonight, we invite you to drift away on the whispers of encounters that have been buried in classified files, forgotten testimonies, and stories too strange for mainstream attention. These are the UFO encounters that slip through the cracks of history, witnessed by ordinary people who found themselves face to face with the extraordinary. As your eyes grow heavy and the world around you fades, let these untold stories carry you into sleep. Each account has been carefully chosen, not for sensationalism, but for their quiet authenticity. The witnesses didn't seek fame or fortune. They simply experienced something that changed their understanding of what's possible in our vast universe. This is Volume 1 of our Unknown series. Close your eyes, let your breathing slow, and allow these mysterious tales to guide you into peaceful rest. Before we dive in, drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from tonight. Now, settle back and let the unknown begin. The Whidbey Island Lighthouse Incident. September 14th, 1962. Puget Sound, Washington. The fog rolled in thick that evening, wrapping Whidbey Island Lighthouse in a blanket of grey silence. Keeper Thomas Mitchell had worked these waters for 18 years, guiding ships through the treacherous currents of Puget Sound with the steady beacon that had never failed. The lighthouse stood 70 feet above the rocky shore, its light cutting through the Pacific Northwest mist like a sword through silk. Thomas lived alone in the keeper's quarters, a modest dwelling built into the lighthouse's base. His wife had passed 3 years prior, and his grown children lived on the mainland. The solitude suited him. He found peace in the rhythmic rotation of the light, the distant call of foghorns, and the endless dance of waves against stone. That September night started like countless others. The Weather Service had issued a fog advisory, and Thomas prepared for a long shift of vigilant watching. Ships would be moving slowly, their captains relying entirely on his beacon to navigate the narrow passage between the island and the mainland. At precisely 10:30, something changed. The lighthouse beam, which had swept its reliable arc for decades, suddenly stopped. Not the light itself, but its movement. The massive Fresnel lens that weighed nearly 2 tons had ceased its rotation, freezing the beam in a single direction, pointing northwest toward the dark waters of the Sound. Thomas rushed to the mechanism room. The clockwork gears that turned the lens were still functioning perfectly. The weights hung properly. Every component moved as designed, yet the beam remained fixed, as if held by an invisible hand. He climbed to the lamp room and peered out into the fog. What he saw made his breath catch in his throat. The lighthouse beam, instead of dispersing into the mist, was being absorbed by something in the water. A dark shape, massive and silent, floated just beneath the surface, roughly 200 yards from shore. The object was enormous, easily the size of a naval destroyer, but it moved with fluid grace that no ship could match. As Thomas watched, the craft began to rise from the water. Steam rolled off its surface as it ascended, not the violent eruption of a submarine breaching, but a gentle, controlled emergence that barely disturbed the surrounding sea. The vessel had no lights, no markings, no visible means of propulsion. Its surface appeared metallic, but seemed to shift and flow like liquid mercury. As it rose higher, Thomas could see it was disc-shaped, with a subtle dome on top, and what appeared to be regularly spaced ports or windows around its circumference. The lighthouse beam continued to bend toward the craft, as if drawn by magnetism. Thomas tried to turn the lens manually, but it wouldn't budge. The beam of light stretched across the water like a bridge, connecting his lighthouse to the hovering object. For nearly 20 minutes, the craft remained stationary above the Sound. Thomas observed it through his binoculars, noting every detail he could make out through the fog. The object pulsed with a faint internal glow that seemed to breathe, growing brighter and dimmer in a steady rhythm. Occasionally, he thought he could see movement behind the windows, shadows that might have been figures moving within. Then, without warning, the craft began to move. It didn't accelerate gradually like an aircraft or ship. Instead, it simply shifted position instantaneously, appearing first in one location, then another, as if teleporting across the sky. Each time it moved, the lighthouse beam followed, maintaining its impossible connection to the vessel. Ships in the channel began to radio for assistance. Their compasses spun wildly. Navigation equipment malfunctioned. Several captains reported seeing strange lights in the fog, but their descriptions varied wildly, as if each observer saw something different. Thomas grabbed his emergency radio and attempted to contact the Coast Guard station at Port Townsend. Static filled the airwaves. He tried multiple frequencies, but every channel produced the same white noise, broken occasionally by what sounded like voices, speaking in an unknown language, their words musical and flowing like water over stones. As the craft continued its display, moving in patterns that defied physics, Thomas noticed something else. The fog around the lighthouse was beginning to clear, but not naturally. It was being drawn upward in spirals, creating a perfect circle of clear air around his station, while the rest of the sound remained shrouded in mist. The temperature began to drop. Thomas could see his breath inside the lamp room, though it was a mild September evening. Frost formed on the windows, creating intricate patterns that resembled mathematical equations or star charts. The metal components of the lighthouse mechanism became so cold they burned to the touch. At exactly 11:47, the phenomenon ended as abruptly as it had begun. The craft shot straight upward and vanished into the overcast sky without sound or flash. The lighthouse beam snapped back to its normal rotation. The fog rolled back in, obscuring the water once again. The radio crackled to life with normal marine traffic. Thomas spent the rest of the night documenting everything he had witnessed. His logbook entry for September 14, 1962 was the longest in the station's history. He sketched the craft from multiple angles, recorded the exact times of each event, and noted the effects on his equipment and the surrounding environment. The next morning, a Coast Guard cutter arrived at the lighthouse. Lieutenant Commander Robert Hayes and 2 technicians came ashore, ostensibly to inspect the navigation equipment following reports of compass anomalies from multiple vessels. They spent 3 hours examining every component of the lighthouse, taking photographs and collecting what they called routine maintenance samples. Thomas showed them his logbook entry. Hayes read it without comment, then asked if he could borrow the book for copying. Thomas never saw those pages again. When the logbook was returned a week later, September 14th had been removed entirely. In its place was a standard entry noting routine maintenance and fog conditions. The official Coast Guard report listed the previous night's events as equipment malfunction caused by atmospheric conditions. The compass anomalies experienced by ships were attributed to unusual magnetic activity associated with the weather front, but Thomas wasn't the only witness. Mrs. Eleanor Vance, who lived in a cottage on the island's eastern shore, had been awakened by her dog's frantic barking. Looking out her bedroom window, she saw the lighthouse beam behaving strangely and what appeared to be a large object hovering over the water. Her account, given to a local newspaper reporter, was published in the Whidbey Island Record, but retracted the following week after what the editor called verification issues. Captain Frank Morrison of the fishing vessel. Mary Catherine had been returning to port when his compass began spinning. He observed the lighthouse beam fixed in one direction and reported seeing a dark mass in the water that didn't appear on his sonar. His radio log from that night was confiscated by maritime authorities for investigation and never returned. 3 months later, Thomas Mitchell was transferred to a lighthouse station in Maine. The official reason given was administrative reorganization. Thomas served there until his retirement in 1978, never again reporting anything unusual. He died in 1985, taking his full account of that September night to his grave. The Whidbey Island Lighthouse was automated in 1963, removing the need for a resident keeper. The Coast Guard cited modernization efforts, though the timing struck many locals as suspicious. The lighthouse still operates today, its beams sweeping faithfully across Puget Sound, but no keeper remains to witness what might appear in the fog-shrouded waters. Local maritime folklore speaks of the night the lighthouse made contact, when the beacon reached out to touch something from beyond our world. Old-timers in the area still tell stories of strange lights over the sound, compass anomalies, and radio static that sounds almost like voices from another realm. The official records show nothing unusual happened on September 14, 1962. But sometimes, on foggy nights when the mist rolls thick across Puget Sound, the lighthouse beam seems to linger just a moment too long in its sweep toward the northwest, as if still searching for something that once answered its call from the depths of the dark water. The Bakersfield Radio Tower Encounter, March 22, 1975, Kern County, California. The night shift at KBAK Radio was supposed to be quiet. Bill Henderson, the overnight engineer, had worked these hours for 6 years, keeping the station's signal strong while the rest of Bakersfield slept. The transmitter building sat on a hill 5 miles outside town, surrounded by oil derricks and rolling golden hills that stretched toward the Sierra Nevada mountains. Bill preferred the solitude. From midnight until 6 in the morning, he monitored the equipment, logged signal strength readings, and occasionally stepped outside to check the tower's aircraft warning lights. The red beacons atop the 300-foot antenna had to flash every few seconds by FAA regulation, and Bill took pride in maintaining perfect compliance. That March night felt different from the moment he arrived at 11:30. The air carried an electric charge that made the hair on his arms stand up. His transistor radio, which usually picked up distant AM stations with crystal clarity, produced nothing but static across every frequency. Even the station's own signal seemed weak and distorted. At 12:45, the power meters began fluctuating wildly. The transmitter, which had run steadily for months, started cycling on and off in regular intervals. Bill checked every connection, tested every component, but found no explanation for the erratic behavior. The equipment appeared to be functioning normally, yet the output readings made no sense. He stepped outside to check the tower and froze. The aircraft warning lights weren't flashing their normal red pattern. Instead, they pulsed with a soft blue glow that seemed to breathe, growing brighter and dimmer in a rhythm that matched his heartbeat. The effect was mesmerizing, almost hypnotic. Looking up the length of the tower, Bill noticed something else that shouldn't have been there. A second set of lights, much brighter than the aircraft beacons, hovered just above the antenna's tip. These weren't attached to the structure. They floated freely in the air, maintaining perfect position relative to the tower, despite a steady breeze that rustled the nearby eucalyptus trees. The lights were arranged in a triangular pattern, each point glowing with intense white radiance that hurt to look at directly. They cast no beam, produced no reflection on the tower's steel framework, and seemed to exist without illuminating anything around them. It was as if the light simply stopped at its source, defying every principle of physics Bill understood. As he watched, the triangle began to descend slowly down the tower's length. The movement was perfectly controlled, maintaining exact spacing and alignment as it traveled. When it reached the halfway point, the station's transmitter surged to full power, sending the strongest signal Bill had ever recorded. The meters pegged at maximum output, far beyond the station's licensed capacity. The phone in the transmitter building began ringing. Bill ran inside to answer, expecting complaints about interference or overmodulation. Instead, he found callers from as far away as Denver and Phoenix, reporting they were receiving K-back's signal with unusual clarity. One ham radio operator in Salt Lake City claimed the station was coming in stronger than local broadcasts. But the strangest call came from Martha Collins, an elderly woman who lived alone on a ranch 10 miles east of the transmitter site. She was frightened and confused, insisting that her radio was playing music and voices in a language she'd never heard. When Bill asked her to describe what she was hearing, she said it sounded like singing, but the voices seemed to come from everywhere at once, not just from her radio speaker. Bill stepped outside again and saw the triangle of lights had descended to just above the transmitter building. They hovered there, perhaps 30 feet overhead, casting their impossible illumination on nothing at all. The air beneath them shimmered like heat waves rising from summer pavement, though the March night was cool and still. That's when he heard it himself, a sound that seemed to come from inside his head rather than through his ears. It wasn't quite music and wasn't quite speech, but something in between. The tones rose and fell in patterns that felt familiar, yet completely alien, as if he were remembering a song he'd never learned from a place he'd never been. The transmitter readings continued to climb beyond anything the equipment should have been capable of producing. Bill worried about damaging the expensive broadcast gear, but every time he moved toward the power controls, the humming in his head grew louder, more insistent. It wasn't painful, but it was overwhelming, filling his consciousness with harmonies that made his fingers tremble and his vision blur. For nearly an hour, the lights maintained their vigil above the station. During that time, K-back signal reached unprecedented distances. Radio enthusiasts across the western United States logged the station's identification and marveled at the impossible propagation. The station's overnight programming, normally heard only within a 50-mile radius, was received clearly in locations over 1,000 miles away. At 2:15 in the morning, everything changed. The triangle of lights suddenly contracted into a single brilliant point, hovered for a moment, then shot straight upward and vanished into the overcast sky. The moment they disappeared, the transmitter readings returned to normal. The mysterious humming stopped. The aircraft warning lights resumed their regulation red flash pattern. Bill checked every meter, every connection, every component in the transmitter building. Everything appeared normal, as if nothing unusual had occurred. The only evidence of the night's events was the logbook entries from distant stations confirming KBAK's extraordinary signal propagation. The next morning, Bill filed his standard engineering report, but made no mention of the lights or the anomalous transmitter behavior. He told himself it must have been some kind of atmospheric phenomenon, perhaps related to temperature inversion or unusual ionospheric conditions. But he knew what he had seen, what he had heard, and what his instruments had recorded. 3 days later, FCC investigators arrived at the station to inquire about reports of excessive signal strength and possible license violations. They examined the transmitter equipment exhaustively, testing every component and reviewing all maintenance records. Their final report concluded that the anomalous propagation was caused by atmospheric ducting, a rare but documented phenomenon that can carry radio signals far beyond their normal range. Bill never spoke publicly about the lights above the tower, but he continued to experience strange phenomena during his overnight shifts. Electronic equipment would malfunction without explanation. He would hear faint music on frequencies that should have been empty. Sometimes, on clear nights, he thought he could see lights moving among the oil derricks in patterns too regular to be aircraft or vehicles. Other radio engineers in the area began reporting similar experiences. Equipment failures that made no technical sense, signals from distant stations appearing with impossible clarity, strange interference that sounded almost like voices speaking in unknown languages. An informal network developed among the overnight technical staff, sharing stories they couldn't explain and didn't dare report officially. The K-back tower still broadcasts today, its red warning lights flashing faithfully through every night. Bill Henderson retired in 1992 and moved to Oregon, but sometimes, when atmospheric conditions are just right, radio enthusiasts still report receiving signals from Bakersfield with unusual strength and clarity. The official explanation remains atmospheric ducting and equipment malfunction, but those who work the overnight hours at radio stations across the American West know there are nights when the airwaves carry more than just programmed content, when the electromagnetic spectrum becomes a pathway for communications that originate far beyond our earthly transmitters. And sometimes, if you listen carefully to the static between stations in the deep hours before dawn, you might hear echoes of that otherworldly song that filled the air above a California radio tower on a March night in 1975. The Cedar Grove Farm Visitation, June 8, 1968. Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. The corn was knee-high that summer, stretching in perfect rows across the fertile Pennsylvania soil. Jacob Stoltzfus had worked this land for 32 years, following the same rhythms his father and grandfather had known. The 100-acre farm sat in a valley between rolling hills, surrounded by other Amish homesteads, where horses pulled plows and lanterns flickered in kitchen windows after sunset. Jacob lived simply with his wife Sarah and their 4 children in a white farmhouse that had sheltered 3 generations of his family. No electricity ran to their home. No telephone connected them to the outside world. They rose with the sun, worked the land with their hands, and found peace in the quiet certainty of their faith. That June evening, Jacob was walking the fence line behind the barn, checking for breaks where cattle might wander. The sun had set an hour earlier, leaving the sky painted in deep purples and soft orange. Fireflies began their nightly dance among the pasture grass, and barn owls called from the old oak that marked the property's eastern boundary. As he rounded the corner near the chicken coop, Jacob stopped. Something was wrong with the animals. The chickens, which should have been settled quietly on their roosts, were agitated, squawking and flapping frantically inside the coop. The horses in the nearby paddock stood pressed against the far fence, ears pinned back, eyes wide with fear. Even Bess, the old milk cow who was afraid of nothing, had moved as far from the barn as the pasture fence would allow. The air felt thick, charged with the kind of energy that comes before lightning strikes. But the sky was clear, dotted with the first emerging stars. Jacob removed his black hat and wiped his brow. Though the evening was cool, his skin tingled as if touched by static electricity. Then he saw the light. It appeared first as a soft glow above the cornfield, maybe 50 yards from where he stood. At first, Jacob thought it might be lantern light from the Byler farm beyond the hill. But this light was different. It moved with purpose, gliding silently, just above the corn tassels, in a perfectly straight line that no person carrying a lantern could maintain. As the light drew closer, Jacob could see it wasn't a flame at all. The glow emanated from something solid, something that displaced the cornstalks as it passed over them. The object was oval-shaped, perhaps 12 feet long and half as wide, with a surface that seemed to shift between metallic grey and deep blue, depending on how the light caught it. Jacob stood motionless, his practical mind struggling to understand what his eyes were showing him. In his community, the unexplained was often attributed to God's mysterious ways, but this felt different. This felt deliberate, intelligent, purposeful in a way that made his chest tighten with an emotion he couldn't name. The craft moved steadily across the field until it reached the edge of the pasture, perhaps 20 yards from where Jacob stood. There it stopped, hovering silently 3 feet above the ground. No sound came from it. No vibration disturbed the evening air. It simply waited, as if observing him as intently as he was observing it. For several minutes, man and craft remained motionless in the gathering darkness. Jacob felt no fear, which surprised him. Instead, he experienced a profound sense of peace, as if standing in the presence of something benevolent, something that meant no harm to him or his family. The feeling reminded him of quiet moments in prayer, when the world seemed to hold its breath and listen. The craft began to glow more brightly, its surface rippling like water disturbed by a gentle breeze. As the light intensified, Jacob noticed something that made his breath catch. Shapes moved within the glow, silhouettes that suggested figures but remained indistinct, like shadows cast on a sheet hung between him and a lantern. One of the shapes approached what Jacob assumed was the craft's surface. A section of the vessel became transparent, and he found himself looking at a being unlike anything in his experience. It stood perhaps 5 feet tall, with a slight build and features that were both familiar and utterly foreign. The face was elongated, with large dark eyes that seemed to hold depths of wisdom and sadness. The skin appeared pale, almost luminescent in the craft's glow. The being looked directly at Jacob, and in that moment of contact, something passed between them. Not words, not sounds, but a communication that bypassed language entirely. Jacob understood, without knowing how, that these visitors came from far beyond the familiar stars, that they had traveled distances his mind couldn't comprehend to observe the quiet life of humans like himself. Images flooded his consciousness. He saw the earth as it appeared from space, a blue marble suspended in infinite darkness. He saw the interconnectedness of all living things, the delicate balance that sustained life on this small world. He felt the visitors' concern for humanity's future, their hope that people would learn to live in harmony with their planet and each other, but most powerfully, he sensed their fascination with his way of life. They observed how his community had chosen simplicity over complexity, how they worked in partnership with the land rather than trying to dominate it. Through some means he couldn't explain, Jacob understood that his people's commitment to peace and stewardship made them worthy of study and respect. The communication lasted only moments, but it felt like hours. When it ended, Jacob found tears running down his cheeks. The being within the craft raised what appeared to be a hand in a gesture that somehow conveyed both greeting and farewell. Then the transparent section returned to its previous opacity, and the craft began to rise. It ascended slowly, maintaining its position above the pasture until it reached perhaps 100 feet in height. There it paused once more, and Jacob felt another wave of that wordless communication. This time, the message was simpler, but no less profound, a sense of gratitude for the encounter and a promise that his family and community would be watched over and protected. The craft then moved with impossible speed, streaking across the sky and disappearing among the stars in seconds. The animals immediately calmed. The horses returned to grazing. The chickens settled on their roosts. Even the air seemed to return to normal, losing that electric charge that had made Jacob's skin tingle. He stood in the pasture for a long time, looking up at the stars and trying to process what had happened. His faith taught him that God worked in mysterious ways, that his creation was vast beyond human understanding. Perhaps what he had witnessed was simply another manifestation of divine mystery, a reminder that the universe held wonders beyond his simple farming life. When Jacob finally returned to the house, Sarah was waiting on the porch. She took one look at his face and asked what had happened. Jacob considered his words carefully. His people valued honesty above all things, but they also understood that some experiences were too sacred to share freely. He told her he had encountered something wonderful in the field, something that had reminded him of God's infinite creation and the importance of living simply and peacefully. Sarah nodded, recognizing in her husband's expression the same look he wore after particularly meaningful worship services. She asked no further questions. Jacob never spoke publicly about what he had seen that night. In his community, extraordinary claims required extraordinary evidence, and he had none to offer except his own testimony. But his family noticed changes in him. He became even more dedicated to sustainable farming practices, even more committed to living in harmony with the natural world. He spoke often about humanity's responsibility to care for creation, not just for themselves, but for future generations. Years later, when researchers investigating UFO sightings in rural Pennsylvania contacted him, Jacob declined to be interviewed. His faith taught him humility, and he saw no value in seeking attention for something that had been given to him as a private gift. The encounter belonged to him alone, a moment of grace that had deepened his understanding of his place in God's vast creation. The cornfield where the craft had hovered continued to produce abundant harvests year after year. Jacob often walked that section of his property in the evenings, sometimes pausing at the spot where the encounter had occurred. He would stand quietly, remembering the profound sense of connection he had felt that night. The understanding that Earth's children were not alone in the universe. The Cedar Grove farm still operates today, now run by Jacob's descendants who continue the family tradition of simple living and careful stewardship of the land. They know the story of their grandfather's encounter, passed down through whispered conversations and quiet family gatherings. None of them have experienced anything similar, but they maintain his respect for the mysteries that surround their quiet valley. Sometimes, visitors to Lancaster County report seeing unexplained lights moving over the Amish farmland, silent glows that drift above the cornfields and pastures before disappearing into the star-filled sky. Local authorities attribute these sightings to aircraft or weather phenomena, but the Amish farmers who work these ancient fields know there are some mysteries that don't require official explanation. They remember Jacob Stoltzfus, who encountered visitors from beyond the stars and found in them not fear but wonder, not threat but blessing. His story serves as a reminder that the universe is vast and full of intelligences that may be watching over humanity's journey with patient hope, waiting for the day when all Earth's children learn to live as simply and peacefully as those who till the soil in Pennsylvania's quiet valleys. The Mojave Desert Signal Station, October 31st, 1971, San Bernardino County, California. The radio telescope dish pointed toward Polaris like a massive eye searching the northern sky. Dr. Elena Vasquez had spent 18 months at the remote listening post, monitoring cosmic background radiation and cataloging radio sources for the National Science Foundation. The facility consisted of 3 buildings and the 60-foot dish, situated in a valley so isolated that the nearest town lay 40 miles away across trackless desert. Elena preferred the solitude. After completing her doctorate at Caltech, she had specifically requested assignment to this outpost where light pollution and radio interference couldn't contaminate her observations. The desert nights offered perfect conditions for radio astronomy, with crystal clear skies and electromagnetic silence broken only by the distant murmur of cosmic radiation. Halloween night, 1971, started like hundreds of others. Elena arrived at the control building as the sun disappeared behind the western mountains, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson. The evening's schedule called for a routine survey of the northern galactic plane, searching for pulsars and other exotic objects that might reveal secrets about stellar evolution. As darkness settled over the Mojave, Elena began her systematic sweep of the sky. The radio telescope's sensitive receivers picked up the usual symphony of cosmic noise, the hiss of interstellar gas, the rhythmic pulses of known pulsars, the steady drone of distant galaxies. She had learned to recognize these sounds like a conductor knows every instrument in an orchestra. At 9:47 p.m., something changed. A new signal appeared on her instruments, unlike anything in her catalogue of cosmic radio sources. It began as a faint warble, almost musical in its complexity, rising and falling in patterns that seemed almost too organized to be natural. Elena adjusted her equipment, thinking she might be picking up interference from a distant broadcast station, but the signal's characteristics didn't match any terrestrial transmission. The frequency was precisely 1420.4 megahertz, the emission line of neutral hydrogen that radio astronomers used as a universal standard. But this wasn't the random hiss of hydrogen clouds drifting through space. This signal carried structure, organization, information encoded in variations of amplitude and phase that suggested intelligent origin. Elena's pulse quickened as she realized what she might be observing. For decades, radio astronomers had speculated about the possibility of intercepting communications from extraterrestrial civilizations. Most searches focused on nearby star systems, looking for signals that might leak from alien worlds like television broadcasts escaped from Earth. But this transmission seemed far more powerful, deliberately directed toward Earth from somewhere beyond the solar system. The signal strengthened over the next hour, becoming clearer and more complex. Eleanor recorded everything, filling magnetic tapes with data while simultaneously taking detailed notes about the signal's characteristics. The patterns seemed to repeat every 12 minutes and 37 seconds, but with subtle variations that suggested it wasn't merely a beacon, but actual communication, perhaps a message meant to be decoded by anyone capable of receiving it. As the night progressed, Elena noticed something else unusual. The radio telescope's pointing system, which normally required constant adjustment to track celestial objects across the sky, had somehow locked onto the signal source. The dish followed the transmission automatically, as if drawn by some invisible force. When she tried to override the system and point elsewhere, the controls wouldn't respond. The telescope remained fixed on coordinates that showed empty space on her star charts. At midnight, the signal suddenly intensified, flooding Elena's receivers with information. The complexity increased dramatically, suggesting multiple channels of data transmission occurring simultaneously on slightly different frequencies. Her recording equipment struggled to capture everything, magnetic tape reels spinning frantically as terabytes of information poured through the desert night. Then the lights appeared. Elena first noticed them through the control room windows, 3 points of brilliant white light hovering above the mountains to the north. They maintained perfect triangular formation, neither moving nor flickering like aircraft navigation beacons. As she watched through binoculars, the lights began to descend toward the valley, growing larger and brighter as they approached. The radio signal reached peak intensity as the lights drew near. Elena's instruments registered power levels that should have overloaded her sensitive receivers, yet somehow the equipment continued functioning normally. The transmission had become so complex that it seemed like dozens of different messages were being broadcast simultaneously, each on its own frequency, but all coordinated in ways that suggested a single massive intelligence behind the communication. The lights settled into a hover pattern directly above the radio telescope, perhaps 500 feet overhead. In their illumination, Elena could see that they weren't separate objects, but parts of a single enormous craft, triangular in shape with rounded corners and a surface that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The vessel was utterly silent, producing no sound despite its massive size. Elena grabbed her emergency radio to call the facility's security office in Barstow, but found only static on every frequency. Her telephone line was dead. Even her battery-powered portable radio produced nothing but white noise. The only functioning communication system was the radio telescope itself, which continued receiving the alien transmission with perfect clarity. For 3 hours, the craft maintained its position above the listening post. During that time, Elena's equipment recorded what she estimated to be the equivalent of several encyclopedia sets worth of information. The transmission seemed to contain multiple types of data, mathematical sequences, what might have been star charts or navigation data, and complex patterns that could have represented anything from poetry to engineering schematics. Most remarkably, portions of the signal appeared to be specifically addressed to Earth. Elena detected references to hydrogen emission, the universal constant that any scientifically advanced civilization would recognize. Other sections contained what seemed to be pictorial representations of atomic structure, mathematical constants, and even what appeared to be a schematic of the solar system with Earth's position clearly marked. At 3:17 a.m., the transmission abruptly ended. The craft above the dish pulsed once with brilliant light, then accelerated straight upward and vanished into the star field. Elena's recording equipment fell silent. The radio telescope's automatic tracking system released its mysterious lock and resumed normal operation. Elena spent the rest of the night reviewing her recordings and notes, hardly believing what she had experienced. The magnetic tapes contained hours of the most complex radio signals ever intercepted by human technology. If authentic, They represented the first confirmed communication from an extraterrestrial intelligence, a discovery that would revolutionize humanity's understanding of its place in the universe. When morning came, Eleanor prepared her report for the National Science Foundation, carefully documenting every aspect of the encounter. She knew the implications were staggering and that her claims would face intense scrutiny. But the evidence was undeniable. The recordings, the telescope logs, the electromagnetic signatures captured by her instruments. 3 days later, a team of officials arrived at the listening post. They identified themselves as representatives from various government agencies, including the NSF, the Air Force, and organizations Elena had never heard of. They spent 2 weeks examining her equipment, reviewing her data, and conducting extensive interviews about the Halloween night encounter. When they departed, they took with them all of Eleanor's recordings, her notes, and even the magnetic tape storage systems. The official report classified the incident as equipment malfunction caused by atmospheric interference and solar activity. Elena was reassigned to a different project at a facility in New Mexico, with strict instructions never to discuss her experiences at the Mojave station. The remote listening post was closed 6 months later, officially due to budget constraints. The radio telescope was dismantled and relocated to a university observatory, though it never again demonstrated the unusual tracking behavior Elena had witnessed. The buildings were abandoned to the desert, gradually succumbing to wind and sand. Elena completed her career in radio astronomy without ever again encountering signals of extraterrestrial origin. She published respected papers on pulsars and cosmic background radiation, but never spoke publicly about the Halloween night, when the universe reached out to touch a lonely outpost in the Mojave Desert. Years later, when researchers investigating government UFO cover-ups contacted her, Elena declined to comment. The official secrecy agreements she had signed remained in effect, and she had learned that some discoveries were too profound for public consumption. The knowledge she carried was both a burden and a privilege, proof that Earth was not alone in the cosmos, but also evidence that contact between worlds remained beyond human control. The Mojave Desert Station site can still be found by those who know where to look. Concrete foundations mark where the buildings once stood, and the circular pad where the radio telescope was mounted remains visible beneath years of accumulated sand. Sometimes, amateur radio operators in the area report picking up strange transmissions on the hydrogen line frequency, complex signals that seem to originate from empty space. Local legend speaks of Halloween night visitations, when lights appear above the abandoned facility and electronic equipment throughout the region experiences mysterious interference. Whether these stories reflect ongoing contact or simply the desert's way of preserving its secrets, the Mojave keeps its silence, holding memories of the night when human science briefly touched the edge of an intelligence vast and ancient beyond imagination. The Great Falls Dairy Incident. May 12, 1963. Montana. Dawn came early to the Riverside Dairy Farm, stretching golden fingers across the pastures where Holstein cattle grazed peacefully along the Missouri River. Frank Morrison had been running the operation for 23 years, following routines as reliable as sunrise. The milking began at 4:30 each morning, when the cows would gather at the barn gates, their udders heavy with the night's production. Frank lived with his wife Margaret and teenage son David in the white 2-story farmhouse that overlooked the dairy operation. 200 head of cattle provided a modest living, supplying milk to the Great Falls Creamery and maintaining a reputation for quality that had been built over 2 decades of careful husbandry. That May morning felt different from the moment Frank stepped outside. The air hung still and heavy, unusual for Montana, where prairie winds typically swept across the landscape with restless energy. The cattle stood motionless in the pre-dawn darkness, their usual lowing replaced by an unnatural silence that made Frank pause at the porch steps. As he walked toward the milking parlor, Frank noticed his border collie, Rex, cowering beneath the farmhouse porch instead of bounding ahead to help gather the herd. The dog whined softly, ears pinned against his head, refusing to emerge despite Frank's coaxing. In 15 years, Rex had never missed a morning milking routine. The cattle themselves presented an even stranger sight. Instead of congregating near the barn as they did every dawn, the entire herd had gathered in the center of the pasture, forming a perfect circle with their heads pointing outward like spokes on a wheel. They stood completely still, their eyes fixed on something beyond the fence line that Frank couldn't see. Frank grabbed his flashlight and approached the unusual formation. The cows didn't acknowledge his presence, didn't turn toward him as they normally would when expecting their morning grain. They remained frozen in position, their breathing shallow, their eyes reflecting an odd greenish tint in the flashlight beam that he'd never noticed before. Beyond the cattle circle, roughly 50 yards toward the river, Frank's light picked up something that made his breath catch. The grass was pressed down in a perfect spiral pattern, as if something enormous had landed and rotated slowly before departing. The depression was nearly 40 feet across, with grass bent in mathematically precise curves that created an almost hypnotic visual effect. As Frank moved closer to examine the marking, the air around him began to hum with a frequency he felt more than heard. The sound seemed to come from the ground itself, vibrating through his boots and into his bones. His flashlight flickered and dimmed, despite fresh batteries installed the evening before. That's when he saw the object. It hung motionless above the river, perhaps 60 feet from the bank and 30 feet above the water's surface. The craft was disc-shaped with a slight dome on top, constructed from what appeared to be polished metal that reflected the early morning stars. No lights adorned its surface, yet it seemed to glow with a soft internal radiance that made its edges clearly visible against the dark sky. The object was massive, easily 100 feet in diameter, yet it produced no sound beyond that low-frequency humming that Frank felt in his chest. No exhaust disturbed the air beneath it. No ripples marred the river's surface, despite the craft's proximity to the water. It simply existed in defiance of everything Frank understood about physics and aerodynamics. For several minutes, he stood transfixed, watching the impossible vessel hover above the Missouri River. His practical rancher's mind searched for explanations. Military aircraft from Malmstrom Air Force Base, perhaps, though nothing in the Air Force inventory looked remotely like this craft. Weather balloon, though no balloon could maintain such perfect stability in the morning air currents. The object began to move, not with the gradual acceleration of conventional aircraft, but with fluid grace that seemed to bend space around it. It drifted upstream, following the river's meandering course while maintaining exact altitude and distance from the water. As it moved, the humming frequency shifted, creating harmonics that resonated through Frank's body like music played on instruments he'd never heard. Frank ran back toward the house, intending to wake Margaret and David so they could witness the extraordinary sight. But when he reached the porch and turned back toward the river, the object had vanished. The morning air was still and quiet once again. Even the humming had stopped, leaving only the normal sounds of awakening prairie life. The cattle, however, remained in their strange formation. Frank approached them again, calling to his lead cow, Bessie, who had always responded to his voice with eager attention. She didn't move, didn't acknowledge his presence, continued staring fixedly toward the spot where the craft had hovered above the river. As the sun crested the eastern hills, casting full daylight across the pasture, the spell seemed to break. The cattle slowly dispersed, moving toward the barn with their usual morning hunger. Rex emerged from beneath the porch, tail wagging tentatively as if awakening from a troubling dream. The familiar rhythms of farm life reasserted themselves, but the spiral marking in the grass remained clearly visible in the morning light. Frank examined it carefully, noting how the vegetation was bent but not broken, pressed down in perfect mathematical curves that created a pattern unlike anything he'd seen in 35 years of farming. No machinery could have created such precise geometry. No natural weather phenomenon could account for the organized spiral design. Frank mentioned the unusual morning to Margaret over breakfast, describing the cattle's strange behavior and the marking in the pasture. He said nothing about the craft above the river, unsure whether he trusted his own perception of something so impossible. Margaret suggested they call the county extension agent to examine the grass pattern, thinking it might indicate some kind of plant disease or soil condition. Agent Robert Casey arrived that afternoon and spent an hour studying the spiral formation. He took soil samples and photographed the pattern from multiple angles, admitting he'd never encountered anything similar in 20 years of agricultural consultation. The grass showed no signs of disease or chemical damage. The soil revealed no unusual mineral content or contamination. The formation appeared to be the result of pure mechanical pressure applied with impossible precision. Casey's report, filed with the Montana State University Extension Service, described the marking as anomalous ground disturbance of unknown origin. He recommended monitoring the area for changes in vegetation growth or soil chemistry. The case was quietly archived without further investigation. Over the following weeks, Frank noticed other changes around the farm. The cattle's milk production increased by nearly 15%, though their diet and care routine remained unchanged. The grass within the spiral pattern grew faster and greener than the surrounding pasture, creating a permanent reminder of that strange May morning. Most remarkably, the affected area seemed to repel insects and plant diseases that typically plagued Montana grasslands. Frank's neighbors began commenting on his improved dairy yields and asking about his secret fertilization methods. He had no explanation to offer, could only point to the mysterious spiral in his pasture and shrug. The phenomenon had transformed his farm in ways both beneficial and inexplicable. 6 months later, a researcher from the University of Montana's physics department contacted Frank about unusual electromagnetic readings detected in the area. Dr. Patricia Wells had been studying magnetic anomalies across Montana and discovered a significant deviation in her instruments when surveying the Riverside Dairy property. The readings centered precisely on the spiral formation, suggesting the presence of residual energy that defied conventional measurement. Dr. Wells spent several days at the farm, taking detailed measurements with sensitive magnetometers and radiation detectors. She found elevated electromagnetic activity throughout the spiral area, with field strength varying in patterns that matched the grass marking's geometric curves. The reading suggested exposure to technology far beyond current human capabilities. Her preliminary findings, submitted to the National Science Foundation, described the site as exhibiting anomalous electromagnetic signatures consistent with exposure to unknown energy sources. The report recommended continued monitoring and possible inclusion in programs investigating unexplained phenomena. Frank never learned the results of any follow-up studies. The Riverside Dairy continued operating successfully until Frank's retirement in 1987. The spiral pattern remained visible in the pasture for nearly a decade, slowly fading as new grass growth gradually obscured the original formation. But the area continued to exhibit unusual properties, producing superior vegetation and maintaining resistance to common agricultural problems that affected surrounding farms. David Morrison eventually took over the dairy operation, expanding it into one of Montana's most productive small farms. He grew up knowing the story of that strange May morning, though Frank shared the full details only with his son, making him promise to treat the information as family history rather than public testimony. When UFO researchers began investigating Montana sightings in the 1990s, they discovered references to the Riverside Dairy incident in Dr. Wells' archived reports. Frank, by then in his 70s, declined interviews but allowed investigators to examine the former spiral site. They found soil samples still showed unusual mineral compositions, and electromagnetic readings remained elevated compared to surrounding areas. The Great Falls Dairy incident represents one of the most thoroughly documented cases of apparent UFO landing traces with physical evidence that persisted for years after the encounter. The combination of witness testimony, soil analysis, electromagnetic measurements, and long-term agricultural effects created a compelling case for those who study such phenomena. Frank Morrison passed away in 2003, taking with him the complete memory of that morning when something from beyond Earth's atmosphere touched down beside the Missouri River. His son David continues to operate the farm, now called Morrison Family Dairy, and sometimes points out to visitors the area where his father witnessed something that changed both their land and their understanding of what might visit rural Montana in the quiet hours before dawn. The river still flows peacefully past the dairy farm, reflecting morning stars and prairie sunrises as it has for millennia. But local folklore preserves the story of the craft that hovered above those waters, silent and impossible, before disappearing into a sky that holds more mysteries than any single witness could hope to understand. The Boundary Waters Encounter. August 19, 1969, Superior National Forest, Minnesota. The canoe cut silently through mirror-still water, its bow wake the only disturbance on the lake's perfect surface. Dr. James Fletcher, a geology professor from the University of Minnesota, had come to the Boundary Waters canoe area for his annual solo camping trip, seeking solitude among the pristine lakes and ancient forests that stretched from Minnesota into Ontario. This year's expedition had taken him deeper into the wilderness than ever before, following a chain of connected waterways to a remote lake that appeared on no tourist maps. The area was so isolated that James had seen no other canoeists for 3 days. No aircraft overhead. No signs of human presence beyond the faint portage trails, carved by generations of voyageurs and native peoples. He had made camp on a small island near the lake's center, a rocky outcrop crowned with towering white pines that had witnessed centuries of northern Minnesota seasons. The campsite offered commanding views in every direction, surrounded by water that reflected the boreal forest like polished obsidian under the late summer sky. James was an experienced outdoorsman who valued the deep silence that only true wilderness could provide. As darkness settled over the forest on August 19th, he sat by his small campfire, updating his journal and preparing for another night under stars undiminished by light pollution. The Milky Way stretched overhead in brilliant detail, a celestial river matching the dark waters that surrounded his island sanctuary. At 10:15, something disrupted the perfect stillness. It began as a sound that seemed to come from the lake itself, a low harmonic vibration that James felt through the bedrock beneath his feet. The frequency was too low to hear clearly, more sensation than sound, like the deepest notes of a pipe organ played at barely audible volume. His campfire flickered, though no wind disturbed the air. The water around his island began to show subtle ripples despite the complete absence of any disturbance. James stood and walked to the island's edge, peering across the dark water toward the source of the mysterious vibration. The forest on the distant shore remained silent, showing no lights or movement that might explain the phenomenon. Even the typical nighttime sounds of the wilderness had stopped. No loons called across the water. No owls hooted from the pines. The entire ecosystem seemed to be holding its breath. The vibration intensified gradually, rising in pitch until it became audible as a deep thrumming that resonated through James's chest cavity. The water ripples grew more pronounced, spreading outward from a point near the lake's northern shore in perfect concentric circles. As James watched, the dark water began to glow. The luminescence started as a faint green phosphorescence beneath the surface, similar to the bioluminescent plankton James had observed in tropical seas. But this light was different, more organized, pulsing in rhythmic patterns that suggested intelligent control rather than natural biological processes. The glow intensified until the entire northern portion of the lake was illuminated by an underwater aurora that cast eerie shadows on the surrounding forest. Then the water began to rise, not in waves or swells, but in a smooth, impossible elevation that defied every principle of hydrostatics James understood. A dome of water formed above the lake's surface, held together by forces that conventional physics couldn't explain. The dome grew larger and taller, rising perhaps 30 feet above the normal waterline while maintaining perfect structural integrity. Within the aqueous dome, James could see something moving. Dark shapes shifted and flowed like creatures swimming through liquid space, but their forms were too regular, too geometric to be any known aquatic life. As he watched in fascination and growing unease, one of the shapes approached the dome's surface and became clearly visible. It was a craft of some kind, sleek and organic in appearance, resembling more a living thing than a constructed vehicle. The object was perhaps 40 feet long, with a surface that seemed to shift between metallic and biological textures. It moved through the water dome with fluid grace, occasionally pausing as if observing the surrounding forest, or perhaps the lone camper on his rocky island. More craft appeared within the dome, at least 6 or 7 objects of varying sizes moving in coordinated patterns that suggested communication or shared purpose. Some were elongated like the first, while others appeared more disc-shaped or spherical. All shared the same shifting surface characteristics, as if constructed from materials that adapted to their environment. James grabbed his camera from the tent, a professional-grade 35mm system he used for documenting geological formations. But when he attempted to photograph the extraordinary scene, the camera malfunctioned. The light meter spun wildly, the shutter mechanism jammed, and the viewfinder showed only distorted images that bore no resemblance to what his eyes were seeing. The water dome persisted for nearly 20 minutes, with the craft moving through it in patterns that became increasingly complex. James observed what appeared to be some kind of systematic exploration or survey, with smaller objects detaching from larger ones and moving to specific coordinates within the dome before returning. The entire operation proceeded with clockwork precision, as if following a predetermined plan. Then, without warning, the dome began to collapse. The water fell back to the lake's surface in slow motion, far more gradually than gravity should have allowed. As it settled, the craft within rose upward, emerging from the lake into the night air, with streams of water cascading from their surfaces like liquid silver. The objects hovered above the lake for several minutes, arranged in a perfect hexagonal formation that rotated slowly around its center. James could see them clearly now, noting details that would remain burned into his memory for the rest of his life. The surfaces were indeed shifting and adaptive, cycling through colors and textures that seemed to respond to their aerial environment. No visible propulsion systems disturbed the air, yet they maintained perfect stability in the forest's natural air currents. One of the craft separated from the formation and approached James's island, stopping perhaps 50 feet from shore and hovering at treetop level. This close, he could see that its surface was covered with intricate patterns that moved and flowed like living circuitry. The object pulsed with internal light that matched the rhythm of the deep vibration still thrumming through the bedrock. James felt no fear, only profound awe at witnessing something so far beyond human technology and understanding. The craft seemed to observe him as intently as he was observing it, creating a moment of interspecies contact that transcended language or conventional communication. He raised his hand in a tentative greeting, and the object pulsed more brightly in what might have been acknowledgement. After several minutes, the craft rejoined its formation above the lake. The entire group then accelerated straight upward, disappearing into the star field with impossible speed and silence. The deep vibration faded. The lake's surface returned to mirror stillness. The forest's nighttime sounds gradually resumed as if awakening from a spell. James spent the remainder of the night sitting by his dying campfire, trying to process what he had witnessed. His scientific training demanded rational explanation, but no conventional theory could account for the water dome, the craft, or the precise control of physical forces he had observed. The encounter challenged everything he thought he knew about physics, technology, and Earth's place in the universe. When morning came, James examined the lake's northern shore, where the phenomenon had originated. The water showed no unusual characteristics. The shoreline revealed no landing traces or physical evidence of the previous night's events. Even his malfunctioning camera had returned to normal operation, though the film from the previous evening showed only blank frames despite the supernatural illumination that had bathed the entire area. James completed his camping trip, but found it difficult to focus on the geological surveys that had brought him to the wilderness. His mind kept returning to the craft in their water dome, to the precise coordination of their movements, to the moment of apparent recognition when one had approached his island for closer observation. Upon returning to the university, James filed his routine expedition report, but made no mention of the extraordinary encounter. His academic reputation depended on empirical observation and reproducible results. A story of alien craft rising from a wilderness lake would destroy the credibility he had built over 15 years of respected geological research, but James couldn't forget what he had seen. He began researching historical accounts of unusual phenomena in the Boundary Waters region, discovering a surprising number of Native American legends describing lights beneath the lakes and visitors from the water who came to observe the forest peoples. French voyagers had recorded similar sightings in their journals, describing luminous objects that emerged from remote lakes during the depths of northern winters. James never returned to that particular lake, though he continued his annual camping trips to other areas of the Boundary Waters. He never again witnessed anything comparable to the August 19th encounter, but he remained convinced that the pristine wilderness harbored secrets that conventional science was not yet equipped to understand or accept. In his private journals, James speculated that the remote lakes might serve as hidden bases for intelligences that preferred to avoid human contact. The Boundary Waters offered millions of acres of protected wilderness, deep clear lakes, and minimal human presence, ideal conditions for covert observation of Earth's biosphere by visitors from elsewhere in the universe. James Fletcher retired from the University of Minnesota in 1995, having published respected papers on Great Lakes geology and mineral formations. He never spoke publicly about his encounter in the wilderness, though his family found detailed notes and sketches among his personal effects after his death in 2008. The documents described that August night in precise scientific language, accompanied by technical drawings of the craft and careful measurements of the water dome phenomenon. The remote lake, where James witnessed the impossible, continues to reflect northern skies in pristine solitude. Occasional canoeists who find their way to its isolated waters sometimes report unusual lights beneath the surface or strange vibrations that seem to come from the depths. Park rangers attribute these accounts to natural phenomena or the effects of wilderness isolation on urban visitors unaccustomed to true darkness and silence. But among those who know the deep woods and hidden waters of the Boundary Waters, stories persist of nights when the lakes glow with otherworldly light and craft rise from depths that may conceal more than ancient glacial sediments. The wilderness keeps its secrets well, protecting mysteries that may be older than human presence in the North Woods, patient as the bedrock itself beneath waters that have witnessed wonders beyond ordinary understanding. The Norfolk Lighthouse Mystery. January 4th, 1957. Virginia Beach, Virginia. Captain William Hartley had guided ships through the Chesapeake Bay approaches for 23 years, his weathered hands steady on the wheel through storms that would send lesser mariners running for harbour. The merchant vessel Stella Maris was making her regular run from Baltimore to Norfolk, carrying grain and manufactured goods through waters Hartley knew like the lines on his palm. The January night was bitter cold, with ice forming on the ship's rigging and a north wind that cut through heavy coats like a blade. First Officer Danny Kowalski stood watch on the bridge, scanning the dark horizon for the familiar beacon of Cape Henry Light that would guide them safely into Norfolk's harbour. The lighthouse had stood sentinel over these waters since 1792, its rotating beam a lifeline for countless vessels navigating the treacherous shoals and shifting sandbars of the Virginia coast. At 11:20 p.m., Kowalski noticed something unusual about the lighthouse beam. Instead of its familiar white flash every 10 seconds, the light was pulsing in an irregular pattern, sometimes bright white, sometimes shifting to blue or green hues that had no business coming from a standard navigation beacon. The rotation had stopped entirely, with the beam now pointing steadily out to sea rather than sweeping its programmed arc across the shipping lanes. Hartley joined his first officer at the wheelhouse windows, studying the distant lighthouse through binoculars. The structure itself appeared normal, a white octagonal tower rising from its rocky foundation exactly as it had for over a century. But the light emanating from its lantern room defied explanation, cycling through colors and intensities that no regulation beacon could produce. The radio crackled with transmissions from other vessels in the area, all reporting the same anomalous behavior from Cape Henry Light. The Coast Guard station at Little Creek responded to the inquiries with confusion of their own, stating that their lighthouse technicians were investigating equipment malfunction and advising all vessels to navigate by backup systems until the problem could be resolved. As the Stella Maris drew closer to the lighthouse, Hartley observed additional details that deepened the mystery. The beam wasn't simply changing colors randomly, but seemed to pulse in deliberate sequences, like a massive signal lamp communicating in some unknown code. The patterns repeated every few minutes with mathematical precision, suggesting intelligent control rather than mere equipment failure. Through his binoculars, Hartley could see something else that made his breath catch. The lighthouse beam wasn't originating from the lantern room at all. The official beacon was dark, its familiar Fresnel lens visible but unlit. Instead, the mysterious colored light was emanating from above the tower, hovering perhaps 50 feet over the lighthouse's peak in defiance of any logical explanation. The source of the illumination was a dark object, roughly oval in shape and completely silent despite its proximity to the lighthouse structure. It maintained perfect position relative to the tower, unaffected by the strong winds that whipped spray from the nearby breakers. No cables or support structures connected it to the lighthouse, yet it remained as steady as if bolted in place. Kowalski grabbed the ship's powerful searchlight and aimed it toward the mysterious object, hoping to get a clearer view of whatever was projecting the impossible beacon. The moment his light touched the hovering craft, every electrical system aboard the Stella Maris failed simultaneously. The engines died. Navigation equipment went dark. Even battery-powered devices stopped functioning, leaving the ship drifting helplessly in the strong current that swept toward the dangerous shoals surrounding the lighthouse. In the sudden darkness and silence, Hartley could hear his crew shouting from below decks, reporting complete power failure throughout the vessel. The ship's emergency diesel generator, designed to start automatically during power outages, remained stubbornly silent. They were dead in the water, at the mercy of tides and currents that could drive them onto the rocks within minutes. The object above the lighthouse seemed to respond to their predicament. The colored beam shifted from its steady seaward direction and swept across the water toward the disabled freighter. When the light touched the Stella Maris, Hartley felt a strange tingling sensation, as if the air itself had become charged with static electricity. The metal components of the ship's structure began to hum with a frequency he could feel in his bones. Then, as suddenly as they had failed, the ship's systems came back online. Engines roared to life. Navigation lights blazed. The radar scope flickered and stabilized, showing their position dangerously close to the shoal waters, but still in navigable depth. Hartley immediately ordered full reverse, backing the Stella Maris away from the rocks, while his crew scrambled to assess the damage from the mysterious power failure. Throughout the restoration of their ship's systems, the object above Cape Henry Light maintained its vigil, continuing to project colored beams across the water in patterns that seemed almost like a lighthouse keeper's signal to passing vessels. But this was no human lighthouse keeper. and the signals bore no resemblance to any maritime communication Hartley had learned in more than 2 decades at sea. Other ships in the area reported similar electrical failures when they attempted to illuminate the mysterious object. The Coast Guard cutter Vigilant, responding to distress calls from multiple vessels, experienced complete systems shutdown when it approached within a quarter-mile of the lighthouse. The crew reported their compass spinning wildly, and their radio equipment producing only static mixed with what sounded like musical tones in no recognizable pattern. For 3 hours, the phenomenon continued. The object maintained its position above the lighthouse, projecting its impossible beacon, while ships throughout the area struggled with intermittent equipment failures and navigation difficulties. The official Cape Henry light remained dark, its century-old mechanism apparently overridden by forces beyond human understanding. At 2:47 a.m., the display reached its crescendo. The colored beams suddenly intensified, painting the entire seascape in shifting hues of blue, green, and silver that turned the winter night into something resembling an Arctic aurora. The illumination was so bright that Hartley could read the print on his navigation charts without artificial light, yet it produced no heat, no glare that hurt the eyes. In that moment of peak illumination, every ship within 10 miles of Cape Henry light experienced the same phenomenon. Their radios simultaneously came alive with a transmission unlike anything in maritime communication. It wasn't speech or Morse code, but a complex harmonic pattern that seemed to convey information through pure music, rising and falling in scales that felt both alien and strangely beautiful. The transmission lasted exactly 90 seconds. When it ended, the object above the lighthouse shot straight upward with incredible speed, disappearing into the overcast sky without sound or flash. The colored beacon vanished with it, leaving only the normal darkness of a winter night on the Chesapeake Bay. Within minutes, Cape Henry light resumed its proper function. The familiar white beam began its regulation sweep across the water, guiding ships with the same reliable precision it had maintained for over a century. Navigation equipment throughout the area returned to normal operation. The crisis was over as suddenly as it had begun. The Coast Guard investigation that followed attributed the incident to atmospheric interference combined with equipment malfunction at the lighthouse station. Officials explained that unusual ionospheric conditions had caused widespread radio and electrical problems, while a temporary failure in the lighthouse's automatic rotation system had created the appearance of anomalous behavior. But the lighthouse keeper on duty that night, Seaman First Class Robert Torres, filed a report that painted a different picture. Torres stated that he had observed the mysterious object from the lighthouse gallery, describing it as a craft of unknown origin that had somehow interfaced with the lighthouse beacon system. His account was classified and removed from official records, and Torres was quietly transferred to shore duty in California. Captain Hartley submitted his own detailed report to both the Coast Guard and his shipping company, documenting the electrical failures, the object above the lighthouse, and the strange musical transmission that had affected multiple vessels. The report was filed away without comment, and Hartley was advised that discussing the incident publicly might affect his master mariner's license. The Stella Maris completed her voyage to Norfolk without further incident, but Hartley noticed lasting effects from the encounter. The ship's compass showed a slight but persistent deviation that required constant correction. Electronic equipment occasionally malfunctioned for no apparent reason. Most remarkably, the ship's radio sometimes picked up faint musical transmissions on frequencies that should have been empty. Echoes, perhaps, of that strange 90-second broadcast from the object above Cape Henry light. Hartley continued sailing the Chesapeake Bay routes for another 8 years before retiring to a small house near Virginia Beach. From his back porch, he could see Cape Henry light sweeping its faithful beam across the water each night, exactly as it had for generations. But sometimes, on clear winter evenings, when the stars were bright and the wind was still, he thought he could see lights moving above the lighthouse that weren't part of any aircraft pattern. Other mariners who worked those waters in 1957 occasionally spoke quietly among themselves about the night when something took control of Cape Henry Light and used it to signal ships with technology far beyond human capability. They shared stories of equipment failures, musical transmissions, and lights that behaved according to laws of physics not found in any textbook. The lighthouse stands today, as it has for over 2 centuries, its automated beacon guiding vessels through the same treacherous waters that have claimed countless ships over the decades. Coast Guard records show no official acknowledgement of the January 4th incident, but maritime folklore preserves the memory of the night, when Cape Henry Light became something more than a simple navigation aid. Local fishing boats still report occasional equipment problems near the lighthouse, brief power failures, and compass deviations that occur without explanation. Some captains claim to have heard faint musical transmissions on their radios during clear winter nights, haunting melodies that seem to come from the direction of the old lighthouse tower. Whether these modern incidents represent lingering effects from the 1957 encounter or new visitations by the same intelligence that once commandeered Cape Henry Light, the Chesapeake Bay keeps its secrets beneath waters that have witnessed centuries of maritime mysteries. The lighthouse beam continues its endless vigil, sweeping across waves that may still carry echoes of that strange night when the boundary between human navigation and otherworldly intelligence briefly dissolved in the coloured light above Virginia's most famous beacon. The Painted Desert Observatory, September 30th, 1974, Arizona. The Painted Desert stretched endlessly under a canopy of stars so brilliant they seemed close enough to pluck from the velvet sky. Dr. Sarah Chen had chosen this remote location specifically for its lack of light pollution, establishing a small private observatory where she could pursue her passion for deep sky photography without the interference that plagued urban installations. The observatory consisted of a single dome housing a 12-inch reflecting telescope, along with a modest living quarters where Sarah could spend weeks at a time capturing images of distant galaxies and nebulae. The nearest town lay 40 miles across trackless desert, making this one of the most isolated research facilities in the American Southwest. Sarah was a meticulous astronomer who had left her position at Lowell Observatory to pursue independent research into stellar formation in distant galaxy clusters. Her photographic plates were renowned for their clarity and detail, published in journals worldwide and sought after by institutions that lacked access to such pristine viewing conditions. That September evening, Sarah was conducting a long-exposure series of the Andromeda Galaxy, her camera mounted to the telescope's primary mirror for a 6-hour photographic sequence that would reveal structural details invisible to visual observation. The desert air was perfectly still, with atmospheric seeing conditions that promised exceptional image quality. At 9:15 p.m., something appeared in her telescope's field of view that shouldn't have been there. Moving across the star field was an object that cast a distinct shadow on her photographic plate, despite emitting no visible light of its own. The shadow was perfectly circular, suggesting a spherical object passing between her telescope and the distant stars of Andromeda. But the object's motion was too slow for a meteor, too fast for an asteroid, and followed a trajectory that defied orbital mechanics. Sarah immediately switched from photographic to visual observation, peering through the telescope's eyepiece to see what was creating the mysterious shadow. What she observed challenged everything she understood about objects that could exist in space near Earth. The craft was enormous, easily several hundred feet in diameter, with a surface that seemed to absorb starlight rather than reflect it. Its shape was perfectly spherical, showing no visible features, no lights, no exhaust trails or propulsion signatures. It moved through space with the serene majesty of a celestial body, yet its trajectory clearly indicated intelligent control rather than natural orbital motion. As Sarah watched, the object began to slow its passage across the starfield, eventually coming to a complete stop relative to her position on Earth's surface. This was impossible according to conventional physics, Objects in space don't simply stop moving unless acted upon by massive forces, and no such forces were apparent in the empty void where the sphere had halted. The object remained stationary for nearly 20 minutes, while Sarah observed it through increasingly powerful eyepieces. At maximum magnification, she could discern subtle variations in the sphere's surface, areas that seemed to shift and flow like liquid metal despite maintaining the object's overall spherical geometry. Occasionally, she thought she detected brief flashes of internal illumination, as if something was active within the mysterious craft. Then the sphere began to approach Earth. Its movement was gradual but unmistakable, growing larger in Sarah's telescope as it descended through the void toward the planet's atmosphere. She grabbed her camera and began taking rapid photographs, documenting the object's approach with the same scientific rigor she applied to her galactic studies. The craft's increasing size allowed her to observe more details of its surface structure and apparent construction. What she saw defied every principle of aerospace engineering she had studied. The sphere showed no heat shielding, no attitude control systems, no visible means of propulsion or life support. Its surface remained perfectly smooth and uniform, even as it approached the upper atmosphere where any conventional spacecraft would begin experiencing thermal stress and plasma formation. At approximately 10:45 p.m., the sphere entered Earth's atmosphere directly above Sarah's observatory. She watched in amazement as the craft descended through the atmospheric layers without producing the characteristic meteor trail that should have accompanied any object of such size entering at orbital velocity. No plasma formed around its surface, no shockwaves disturbed the desert air. It simply glided downward as if the atmosphere offered no resistance whatsoever. The object settled into a hover pattern roughly 500 feet above the observatory dome, maintaining perfect stability despite high-altitude winds that should have affected any aircraft or balloon. Sarah stepped outside and could see it clearly with the naked eye, a dark sphere silhouetted against the starfield, completely silent and showing no external lights or activity. For the next hour, the craft remained motionless above the observatory, while Sarah documented its presence with both photographs and detailed written observations. Her instruments detected no electromagnetic emissions, no radio signals, no thermal signature that would indicate conventional propulsion or power systems. The sphere seemed to exist in perfect equilibrium with its environment, requiring no energy expenditure to maintain its position. At midnight, the phenomenon took an unexpected turn. The craft began to project a beam of invisible energy towards Sarah's telescope, though she only became aware of this when her photographic equipment started malfunctioning. Images that should have shown empty space instead revealed complex geometric patterns, mathematical equations, and what appeared to be star charts of unfamiliar constellations. The projected information continued for nearly 2 hours, filling plate after plate with data that seemed to originate from the hovering sphere. Sarah found herself changing photographic plates mechanically, as if compelled to record everything the craft was transmitting. The patterns were incredibly complex, suggesting scientific or technical information far beyond current human knowledge. Most remarkably, some of the projected images appeared to show Sarah's own observatory from an external perspective, as if the sphere was sharing its view of the facility and surrounding desert. Other images depicted what looked like technical diagrams of her telescope and camera equipment, drawn with precision that indicated detailed scanning and analysis of her instruments. At 2:15 a.m., the transmission suddenly stopped. The sphere began to rise, ascending through the atmosphere as silently as it had descended. Sarah watched it climb back into space, growing smaller until it merged with the background stars and disappeared from view. The desert returned to its normal stillness, leaving only the recorded evidence of the extraordinary encounter. When Sarah developed her photographic plates the next morning, she found herself in possession of the most unusual astronomical images ever captured. Alongside her intended photographs of the Andromeda Galaxy were hundreds of frames containing information that appeared to represent advanced scientific knowledge, star charts of unknown regions, and technical diagrams that suggested technologies far beyond human capability. The implications were staggering. If authentic, the photographs represented the first documented case of information transfer from an extraterrestrial intelligence, a systematic sharing of knowledge that could revolutionize human understanding of science and technology. But the complexity and alien nature of the information made analysis virtually impossible without reference points to guide interpretation. Sarah spent weeks studying the transmitted data, consulting with colleagues who specialized in various scientific disciplines. Mathematicians identified some patterns as representing advanced geometric principles. Physicists recognized equations that seemed to describe exotic forms of energy manipulation. Astronomers noted star patterns that didn't match any known region of the observable universe. But the scientific community's response was cautious to the point of rejection. The extraordinary nature of Sarah's claims, combined with the impossibility of reproducing the phenomenon, led most researchers to dismiss the photographs as elaborate hoaxes or the result of equipment malfunction. Without independent corroboration, the evidence was deemed insufficient to support such revolutionary conclusions. Sarah continued her work at the Painted Desert Observatory, but never again experienced contact with the mysterious sphere. Her subsequent astronomical photographs showed only conventional deep sky objects, with no sign of the intelligence that had once shared its knowledge with a solitary observer in the Arizona desert. The photographed information remained in Sarah's possession until her death in 1998, when it was donated to the University of Arizona's Astronomy Department. The plates are stored in their archives, available to researchers who might someday develop the theoretical framework necessary to decode their alien contents. The Painted Desert Observatory operates today as an automated facility. Its telescope controlled remotely by students and faculty who continue Sarah's work in deep sky photography. The location remains one of the premier dark sky sites in North America, offering views of the cosmos unimpaired by human light pollution. Sometimes, astronomers working at the facility report unusual readings on their instruments, brief electromagnetic anomalies that occur without explanation. A few have claimed to observe objects moving through their telescope fields of view, with trajectories that seem to defy orbital mechanics, though none have reported direct contact comparable to Sarah's 1974 encounter. The desert keeps its secrets well, preserving memories of the night when knowledge from beyond the stars was offered to a single human observer patient enough to watch and record. Whether that knowledge will ever be decoded and understood remains a question for future generations of scientists who may possess the theoretical tools to bridge the gap between human understanding and the advanced intelligence that once visited a lonely observatory under the brilliant skies of the American Southwest. The Lake Champlain fishing incident, July 3, 1961. Vermont, New York border. The morning mist clung to Lake Champlain's surface like a gossamer veil, diffusing the early sunlight into soft gold that painted the water in shades of amber and rose. Captain Pete Broussard had been guiding fishing parties on these waters for 18 years, his weathered hands steady on the wheel of the Miss Nancy as she cut through the gentle swells toward his favorite northern pike spot near the Vermont shoreline. His passengers that July morning were the Henderson family from Albany, city folks who had hired Pete for a weekend fishing expedition that promised to escape the summer heat in the cool mountain air surrounding the 120-mile lake. Tom Henderson, his wife Marie, and their teenage twins David and Susan were eager for their first taste of serious freshwater angling. Armed with new tackle and boundless enthusiasm, Pete knew these waters better than most men know their own backyards. Every reef, every drop-off, every current that carried baitfish through the depths held memories of successful trips and satisfied customers. The lake stretched from Whitehall, New York, to the Canadian border, a vast inland sea nestled between the Green Mountains of Vermont and the Adirondacks of New York, fed by mountain streams and deep springs that kept the water crystal clear even in midsummer. The Miss Nancy was Pete's pride, a 30-foot sport fisherman equipped with the latest sonar gear and radio equipment. She could handle the sudden squalls that swept down from the mountains without warning, and her shallow draft allowed access to the protected coves where the biggest fish like to feed in the early morning hours. At 7:30 a.m., Pete anchored the boat over a submerged reef known locally as Henderson Point, though the coincidence of names with his passengers went unnoticed in the excitement of preparing tackle and bait. The sonar showed the classic signature of feeding fish, dark clouds on the screen that indicated schools of perch and bass that would attract the predatory pike they were seeking. Tom Henderson was the first to get a strike, his rod bending double as something substantial took his spoon lure and headed for deep water. Pete coached him through the fight, offering advice on when to reel and when to let the fish run, while the rest of the family gathered around to watch the battle between angler and fish. As Tom worked his catch toward the boat, Pete noticed something unusual on his sonar screen. Below the scattered fish signatures, at a depth of nearly 80 feet, a large solid object was rising slowly from the lake bottom. The return was too big and too regular to be a school of fish, too dense to be a log or debris. It appeared to be ascending steadily, maintaining a course that would bring it directly beneath their anchored boat. Pete studied the sonar display with growing concern. In 18 years of fishing Lake Champlain, he had never seen anything like the massive signature that was approaching from the depths. The object was enormous, easily the size of a small building, and its movement was too controlled, too purposeful to be explained by natural causes. Tom successfully landed his pike, a respectable 12-pounder that brought cheers from his family and promises of an excellent fish dinner that evening. But Pete's attention remained fixed on his sonar screen, watching the mysterious object continue its steady ascent from the lake's depths toward the surface, where the Miss Nancy floated in growing anticipation of whatever was rising to meet them. At 8:15 a.m., the lake's surface began to change. The gentle swells that had been lapping against the boat's hull were replaced by a subtle but unmistakable upward pressure, as if something enormous was displacing water from below. The Miss Nancy rose several inches as the water level around them increased, yet the lake's surface remained mysteriously calm, showing none of the turbulence that should have accompanied such massive displacement. Marie Henderson was the first to notice the change in the water's appearance. Looking over the side of the boat, she called Pete's attention to what looked like a glow emanating from the depths, a soft green phosphorescence that grew brighter as the mysterious object approached the surface. The luminescence was unlike anything Pete had seen in nearly 2 decades of fishing these waters, more intense than the bioluminescent plankton that sometimes glowed on warm summer nights. The sonar signature was now less than 30 feet below the surface and rising faster. Pete considered starting the engines and moving away from whatever was ascending beneath them, but a strange calm had settled over the water that made such action seem unnecessary. The lake felt peaceful, welcoming, as if the approaching presence meant no harm to the small fishing boat and its occupants. At precisely 8:23 a.m., the object breached the surface. It rose from the depths with infinite grace, shedding water like a whale surfacing to breathe. But this was no creature of flesh and blood. The craft was metallic and smooth, shaped like an enormous oval that stretched nearly 100 feet from end to end. Its surface was mirror-bright, reflecting the surrounding mountains and morning sky with perfect clarity, while somehow maintaining its own internal luminescence. The Henderson family stood transfixed as the impossible vessel settled on the lake's surface perhaps 50 yards from their boat, floating with the stability of a ship designed for water travel despite its obvious extraterrestrial origin. No waves disturbed the lake around it. No wake marked its emergence from the depths. It simply existed on the water as if it had always been there, patient and benign in the morning sunlight. Pete grabbed his marine radio to report the extraordinary sighting to the Coast Guard station at Burlington, but found only static on every frequency. His sonar equipment had gone completely dark, its screen showing nothing but electronic snow. Even his compass was spinning slowly, unable to find magnetic north in the presence of whatever forces the craft was generating. For nearly 20 minutes, the two vessels shared the quiet waters of Lake Champlain in a scene that defied every assumption about what was possible in the ordinary world. The alien craft showed no signs of activity, no lights or sounds or movement beyond the gentle rocking motion that any floating object would experience on the lake's surface. It seemed to be observing them as intently as they were observing it. David Henderson, the more adventurous of the twins, grabbed his father's camera and began taking pictures of the extraordinary sight. The craft was close enough that his telephoto lens captured remarkable detail of its surface structure, which appeared seamless and uniform, yet somehow alive, as if constructed from materials that could adapt and flow like living tissue while maintaining metallic strength. Then, without warning, the craft began to sink. It didn't submerge like a conventional submarine, forcing water aside with mechanical violence. Instead, it seemed to become one with the lake itself, passing through the surface tension as if the water offered no resistance at all. The Henderson family watched in amazement as the enormous vessel descended into the depths with the same impossible grace it had shown during its emergence. Within minutes, the craft had vanished completely, leaving only the gentle swells of normal lake water and the stunned silence of 5 people who had witnessed something that would forever change their understanding of what was possible in the world. Pete's instruments gradually returned to normal operation. His radio crackled back to life with routine marine traffic. The sonar screen showed only the familiar signatures of fish and lake bottom topography. When they returned to port that afternoon, Pete filed a routine trip report that made no mention of the extraordinary encounter. The Henderson family developed their photographs, but found that the images of the craft were strangely blurred and indistinct, showing only vague shapes on the water that could have been logs or debris, rather than the clear details they remembered seeing through the camera viewfinder. Pete continued guiding fishing parties on Lake Champlain for another 15 years before retiring to a small cottage near Burlington. He never spoke publicly about the July morning when something from beneath the lake rose to observe a small fishing boat and its passengers, but he never forgot the sense of peaceful contact with an intelligence far beyond human understanding. The Henderson family returned to Albany with fish stories that would last a lifetime, though they rarely shared the most extraordinary tale from their Vermont fishing trip. The photographs they had taken remained in their family album, enigmatic images that served as the only physical evidence of their encounter with something that transcended ordinary experience. Over the years, other anglers on Lake Champlain reported similar sightings. Fishermen spoke quietly of objects rising from the deep water, of sonar readings that showed impossible signatures before vanishing without explanation. The lake's legendary monster, Champ, gained new dimensions in local folklore as witnesses described encounters that seemed more technological than biological. Pete Broussard kept detailed logs of his fishing expeditions, and researchers who later gained access to these records found dozens of entries describing unusual sonar readings, electromagnetic interference, and sightings of objects that didn't behave like any known aquatic life. His entries were precise and factual, recorded in the careful handwriting of a man who understood the importance of accurate observation. The Miss Nancy was sold when Pete retired, eventually ending up in the hands of a charter captain who reported persistent compass problems and sonar anomalies that defied repair. Electronics technicians could find nothing wrong with the equipment, yet the instruments continued to malfunction in specific areas of the lake, always in deep water far from shore, where the bottom dropped away into mysterious depths. Lake Champlain stretches 400 feet deep in some areas, its bottom carved by ancient glaciers that left underwater canyons and caverns largely unexplored by human technology. The lake connects to underground waterways that extend for unknown distances beneath the mountains, creating a vast aquatic system that could easily conceal intelligences that preferred to avoid surface detection. Marine biologists studying the lake's ecosystem occasionally reported sonar contacts that didn't match any known species, objects too large and too organized in their movements to be schools of fish, yet too mobile to be geological formations. These anomalous readings were usually dismissed as equipment errors or misidentified debris, but the pattern of reports suggested something more systematic was occurring in the lake's hidden depths. The Henderson twins, David and Susan, grew up to become marine biologist and aerospace engineer respectively, their career choices perhaps influenced by that July morning when they witnessed technology that seemed to bridge the gap between underwater and spacefaring capabilities. They never forgot the craft that rose from Lake Champlain's depths, its impossible grace challenging everything they thought they knew about physics and engineering. In 1987, a team of researchers using advanced underwater scanning equipment detected what they described as artificial structures on the lake bottom in areas that matched some of Pete's logged anomaly locations. The structures appeared too regular and too large to be natural formations, but were located at depths that made direct investigation prohibitively expensive and dangerous. The research was quietly discontinued when funding was withdrawn, officially due to budget constraints, but possibly because the implications of confirming artificial structures in Lake Champlain would raise questions that government agencies weren't prepared to address publicly. The scanning data was classified and removed from public access, joining the growing collection of evidence that some mysteries were deemed too significant for open investigation. Lake Champlain continues to attract fishermen and recreational boaters who occasionally report unusual encounters with objects or phenomena that don't appear in any wildlife guide or navigation manual. The lake keeps its secrets beneath waters that may conceal more than ancient shipwrecks and native fish species. Local maritime folklore has evolved to include stories of underwater visitors who rise from the depths to observe surface dwellers with benevolent curiosity. These tales join the older legends of lake monsters and ghost ships, creating a rich mythology that acknowledges the possibility that Earth's waters may harbor intelligences far older and more advanced than human civilization. The morning mist still rises from Lake Champlain at dawn, diffusing sunlight into the same golden hues that illuminated an impossible encounter on a July morning in 1961. Fishing boats still anchor over the deep reefs where the biggest fish feed, their captains watching sonar screens that sometimes show returns too large and too purposeful to be explained by conventional marine biology. Pete Broussard's legacy lives on in the careful logs he kept, documenting anomalies that suggest Lake Champlain holds secrets that conventional science has yet to acknowledge or understand. His records serve as a reminder that the boundary between the known and unknown may be as thin as the surface tension that separates air from water, concealing wonders that rise occasionally to touch the ordinary world with profound mystery. The Albuquerque Radio Anomaly, December 17, 1966, New Mexico. The high desert air was thin and clear that December evening, perfect for radio wave propagation across the vast expanse of New Mexico's Rio Grande Valley. Jerry Martinez had been working the night shift at Coat radio station for 6 years, maintaining the transmitter equipment that sent their signal across the southwestern United States from towers perched on the mesa overlooking Albuquerque. Jerry was a meticulous engineer who took pride in maintaining crystal clear transmission quality. The station's 50,000-watt transmitter could reach listeners from Colorado to Mexico on clear nights, carrying news, music, and local programming across the high desert, where radio waves traveled with exceptional clarity through the dry mountain air. That December night started routinely enough. Jerry arrived at the transmitter building at 11 p.m. for his usual overnight shift, checking power levels, monitoring signal strength, and logging the hourly readings required by FCC regulations. The equipment hummed with familiar efficiency in the climate-controlled room, surrounded by acres of open desert where the station's antenna array stretched toward the star-filled sky. At 12:47 a.m., something began interfering with their broadcast signal. Jerry first noticed it as a subtle distortion in the audio, a faint harmonic overlay that seemed to pulse in rhythm with an unknown source. The interference wasn't random static or atmospheric noise, but something organized, almost musical in its complexity. He checked every component in the transmitter chain, from the studio feed to the final amplifier stage, but found no equipment malfunction that could account for the anomalous signal. The interference grew stronger over the next hour, evolving from subtle distortion into clear audio that seemed to be mixing with Coates' regular programming. Jerry could hear what sounded like voices speaking in an unfamiliar language, their words flowing with liquid cadences that reminded him of singing rather than conventional speech. The voices were accompanied by tones that seemed to come from instruments he couldn't identify, creating harmonies that were both beautiful and utterly alien. Jerry attempted to locate the source of the interference by switching to directional antennas and monitoring different frequencies. What he discovered challenged everything he understood about radio propagation. The interfering signal was coming from directly above the transmitter site, originating from a point in space where no aircraft or satellite should have been broadcasting. As the strange transmission continued, Jerry noticed changes in his equipment that defied explanation. Power meters showed readings that exceeded the transmitter's rated output, yet no damage occurred to the sensitive electronics. The antenna system began radiating signals on frequencies it wasn't designed to handle, somehow adapting its characteristics to accommodate the mysterious interference. At 2:15 a.m., Jerry stepped outside to check the antenna towers for any physical cause of the anomalous behavior. What he saw made him question his own senses. Hovering silently above the antenna array was a craft unlike anything in his experience, a sleek metallic object perhaps 80 feet long, that maintained perfect position despite high desert winds that should have affected any aerial vehicle. The craft was connected to the radio station's antennas not by physical cables, but by streams of energy that glowed with soft blue radiance. The energy beams flowed between the hovering object and the antenna elements, creating a network of light that pulsed in synchronization with the mysterious audio, interfering with their broadcast. Jerry rushed back inside and contacted the Federal Aviation Administration to report an unidentified aircraft over their transmitter site. The FAA duty officer confirmed that no flight plans had been filed for the area and no aircraft were showing on radar in that location. Air traffic control at Albuquerque International Airport reported clear skies with no unusual targets on their screens. The interference reached its peak intensity around 3 a.m., completely overwhelming Coates' regular programming with the alien transmission. Jerry's recording equipment captured everything, filling tape reels with audio that seemed to contain multiple layers of information, encoded in ways that conventional analysis couldn't decode. The music, if it could be called that, created emotional responses in Jerry that he couldn't explain, filling him with sensations of wonder, longing, and connection to something vast and incomprehensible. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the phenomenon ended. The craft above the antennas shot straight upward and vanished into the night sky without sound or visible acceleration. The energy beams connecting it to the radio equipment disappeared instantly. Coates' signal returned to normal, clear and strong, as it had been for years. Jerry spent the remainder of his shift documenting the incident and reviewing his recordings. The audio tapes contained nearly 3 hours of the alien transmission, complex harmonies and linguistic patterns that seemed to represent some form of advanced communication. The power logs showed impossible readings that suggested the station had briefly become part of a broadcasting system far more sophisticated than human technology could produce. When the day shift arrived, Jerry filed his standard engineering report, but made no mention of the extraordinary events. His supervisor noticed the anomalous power readings in the logs and scheduled a complete equipment inspection, but technicians found all systems functioning perfectly with no signs of malfunction or damage. The recordings Jerry had made were stored in the station's archive, labeled simply as interference Equipment test, December 17th, 1966. Management assumed they contained routine technical recordings and paid them no attention. Jerry never requested their return, uncertain how he could explain their contents to anyone who hadn't witnessed the night's events. Over the following weeks, Jerry began receiving reports from radio enthusiasts across the Southwest who claimed to have heard unusual transmissions on Coates frequency during the early morning hours of December 18th. Ham radio operators described picking up signals that sounded like music from another world, accompanied by voices speaking in languages that didn't match any Earth culture they could identify. The reports came from locations spanning hundreds of miles, suggesting that whatever had interfaced with Co-8's transmitter had broadcast the alien signal across a vast area. Radio propagation experts were puzzled by accounts of the station's signal reaching areas far beyond its normal coverage pattern, with clarity and strength that exceeded the laws of physics governing electromagnetic wave transmission. Jerry continued working at Co-8 for another 12 years, but never again experienced contact with the intelligence that had used their station as a relay point for its mysterious communication. He became something of a local expert on radio anomalies, quietly collecting reports from other broadcast engineers who had encountered similar phenomena at facilities across the American Southwest. A network of sorts developed among radio technicians who had experienced unexplained interference, equipment behavior that defied conventional understanding, and contact with signals that seemed to originate from sources beyond Earth's atmosphere. They shared their stories discreetly, knowing that public discussion could endanger their careers in an industry that valued reliability and rationality above speculation about extraterrestrial contact. The Co-8 recordings remained in storage until the station was sold in 1985, when most of the archive was disposed of during the transition to new ownership. Jerry managed to retrieve the December 17th tapes before they were destroyed, keeping them in his personal collection as the only physical evidence of the night when something from beyond the stars borrowed a radio station to share its message with the sleeping Southwest. Analysis of the recordings by audio engineers in later years revealed layers of complexity that seemed to increase with each technological advancement in signal processing. Digital analysis uncovered mathematical relationships in the harmonic structures that suggested knowledge of physics, principles not yet understood by human science. The vocal patterns showed linguistic characteristics that didn't match any known Earth language family, yet conveyed emotional content that seemed universally recognizable. Jerry Martinez retired from broadcasting in 1987 and moved to a small ranch outside Santa Fe, where he continued monitoring radio frequencies as a hobby. His equipment occasionally picked up brief transmissions that reminded him of that December night, fragments of the same musical language that had once filled the desert air around Albuquerque's transmitter towers. The high mesa, where Co-8's antennas once stood, is now home to a cellular phone relay station, its digital signals carrying mundane conversations across the same airspace where an alien intelligence once borrowed human technology to broadcast its incomprehensible message. The radio station itself operates from a modern facility in the city, its engineers unaware of the extraordinary contact that once occurred at their former transmitter site. Sometimes, late at night, when atmospheric conditions are perfect for long-distance radio propagation, operators across the Southwest report hearing faint music on frequencies that should be empty. The transmissions last only minutes and resist recording, as if they exist only for those patient enough to listen, in the quiet hours when the desert holds its breath and waits for voices from beyond the stars. The Albuquerque radio anomaly stands as a reminder that the electromagnetic spectrum may carry more than human communications, that the invisible waves surrounding us might occasionally intersect with intelligences that use technologies we can barely imagine. In the vast spaces between radio stations, in the quiet frequencies where no terrestrial signals venture, something may still be broadcasting messages that wait for ears advanced enough to understand their meaning. The desert remembers that December night when the boundary between human and alien communication briefly dissolved in streams of blue energy connecting Earth's primitive radio technology to something infinitely more sophisticated. The memory lives on in archived recordings that grow more mysterious with each passing year, preserved evidence of the night when New Mexico's high desert became a relay point for signals from the depths of space. And now, as the final story fades into the quiet of the night, we come to the end of our journey through these forgotten encounters. These accounts, buried in classified files and dismissed by officials, represent just a fraction of the experiences that ordinary people have shared with intelligences from beyond our world. Sleep peacefully, knowing that we are not alone in the universe. And if you dream tonight of lights in the sky or visitors from distant worlds, perhaps you're receiving echoes of truths that transcend the boundaries of ordinary experience. Until we meet again in Volume 2.